And so this is ultimately a battle over what makes us human. And, it really is a battle for the fate of the species.
Welcome to the show that the fact checkers warned you about. The one that debunks the mainstream narrative and gives you high signal, actionable content that helps you navigate the cloud world. It's Bombthrower TV with your host, Mark Jeftovic.
Hi, everyone. Bombthrower TV. I am Mark Jeftovic, and with me today is the one, the only Whitney Webb. It's been a long time coming, so I'm really glad to have you on today. And we're here on Bombthrower TV. Just a quick bit of background. My audiobook business is doing your audiobook, One Nation Under Blackmail.
Mm-hmm.
I typically like to do an interview with the author of each book we do. But I've kind of started my other podcast, Bombthrower TV, is just I'm just consolidating everything there. So everything happens under Bombthrower TV. And then there's a few other channels, but here you are. And, I started coming across your work many years ago. I think I first heard you on probably Quoth the Raven, Chris Irons.
Oh, right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then lately, I mean, people that I know from within the Bitcoin circles, because I'm like a Bitcoin maxi. So you were on Marty Bent's show. And then just recently on Robert Breedlove's show. You've been on both those shows multiple times. And I know you talk about Bitcoin sometimes in terms of like gaining resiliency and independence, but you're not really you don't have like orange laser eyes in your Twitter.
No,
Twitter bio.
So I'm not interested in telling people where or how to spend their money. I feel like, my job and what I do is about giving people information and letting them make their own decisions based off of that, their own analysis of that information. And that's why I encourage people to engage with source links in my work and things like that. So, I'm not really in the business of telling people what to think, with articles I write even. So why would I tell people where to spend their money? I mean, ultimately, when people ask me about like what they should do, I say, ultimately what people need to do to avoid being sort of sucked into this technocratic system of extreme dystopia being set up is that you have to sort of invest in whatever a parallel system to that looks like for you. And if Bitcoin is part of your path to that goal, then cool. And if it's not, also cool. What ultimately matters is that you're spending your money on things that are going to keep you and your family, fed and sheltered and relative, as safe as you can be, in this period of really unprecedented stability that the world is entering into. And for some people, Bitcoin's part of that. And for some people, it's not. And, it's not my place to tell people what should be their journey to that endpoint. I just think that's, the best endpoint that most people that want to not be a part of the system they're building should be moving toward. So, but that being said, I think there is a lot of Bitcoin obviously has some sort of promise in the sense that it's very obvious from the powers that be that they have a vested interest in destroying Bitcoin in particular in a way that is it's not the same for other cryptocurrencies, right? Bitcoin is uniquely targeted by the powers that be. And I think that's going to escalate in the short term. And a lot of it's, I'm actually going to be doing a video on this hopefully next week, but for The Last American Vagabond, where I contribute sometimes, I did a 2-part series, I think back in 2021. And this was about a couple different things, but mainly about the World Economic Forum's partnership against cybercrime and how essentially the policy decisions that are being made, and now they're being echoed by top people in the Biden administration, is the idea of eliminating anonymity in the digital realm completely. So this is part of it is ending financial anonymity, and that's the part where they want to try and bring Bitcoin to heel. But the other part of it is eliminating online anonymity in its entirety, meaning that your internet access is linked to a government issued ID. And obviously this is meant to be tied into the digital ID infrastructure that we see being built, with increasing speed these days. But if you look at groups like the WEF Partnership Against Cybercrime, they're arguing for that policy. So I would say that the battle against Bitcoin is also sort of a battle against privacy in general online. It's and obviously financial privacy is a major threat to them, because they want to know what everyone's doing. They don't want people to be quote unquote unbanked, right? Or they require that people continue to use central banks and commercial banks despite the obvious corruption of both of those entities. And it's no surprise that the WEF and their affiliates at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and their cyber policy stuff work very closely with central banks and work very closely with Wall Street and also national security agencies. And they're essentially looking to merge all of those entities into one. And obviously something like Bitcoin, or a truly decentralized cryptocurrency framework that allows for, robust anonymity and things of that nature, and true decentralization is not going to is going to challenge a system like that. If they're trying to centralize power in the financial realm to the extent that they're merging national security agencies with Wall Street and central banks, that's just total insanity, right? But it's an obvious, extreme push towards centralization of power. I guess you could say financial power, and the type of power the national security state wields. So there's this effort to centralize that in an unprecedented way. So anything that challenges that to a significant extent, they're going to try and destroy. So I would encourage people that are invested in Bitcoin or see Bitcoin as promising, to also be realistic of the uphill battle it faces and what potentially may be thrown at it down the line by people who are, obviously threatened by what it offers.
Well, we can touch back on that, because I have some thoughts around that. But sure. One of the things you mentioned, and I think the phrase that I really picked up on in your last talk on Robert Breedlove's What Is Money show, is the colonization of the mind, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what this whole merger of this super centralized state is all about, and the WEF, and we can get to that. But I think let's just do a little bit of a base work. Like, I know people who are following your work are well familiar with what it's about and what you've been covering. There's so much of it, no one's ever going to be able to get their arms around the whole thing. I don't know how you do it. I mean, the book was, when I originally met or started talking to Chris at your publisher about what it was like an Epstein biography, and then it became two volumes, and now it's much beyond that, right? So I'd say the TLDR would be, it's One Nation Under Blackmail is not about Epstein per se. You mentioned the mainstream media, that focus is on between 2000 2006, even the obfuscation of the client list. It's all what you call a limited hangout, right? It's just come out, and so it's all being a limited hangout. Your book is everything else. It's the merger of the organized crime and the intelligence agencies of the world, going back to World War II or even before. So maybe we cover a little bit of that, and then sort of go to where we are now with, James Bondian villains like Klaus Schwab and people like that, trying to talk about brain transparency and data mining our brainwaves. How did we get from there to here?
Yeah. Okay. So that's like a huge jump to make. So there's a lot of different ways, I guess, to get from point A to point B there. So I guess I'll start off with a pretty brief summary of organized crime and intelligence. So During World War II, it was justified as being out of wartime necessity. The Office of Naval Intelligence and the precursor to the CIA, the Office of Strategic Services, made an alliance, more or less, with organized crime networks, specifically what was known as the National Crime Syndicate, which was a somewhat informal alliance between the Jewish mob and the Italian mafia. Because remember, back historically, organized crime in the United States has existed sort of like in ethnic silos. So you'll have, the Irish or the Italians or the Jews and whatever that are involved. It's all by their ethnic group. And so Mayor Lansky of the Jewish mob and Charles Luciano of the Italian mafia were childhood friends and decided that they could be a lot more successful if they sort of moved away from that ethnic silo model. And so one of the things they did, and this was sort of informed by some mentors to Mayor Lansky within the Jewish organized crime networks as well, was to sort of infiltrate the unions. So this was very successful for them and allowed them to essentially take over the Democratic Party, specifically in New York City, then New York State, and then expanding from there on out. And that's not to say that this didn't happen in other major urban centers of the U.S. in the same period. I mean, you have the same thing essentially going on with Chicago. And then as a lot of these networks move out west to places like Las Vegas and Los Angeles, it's essentially a lot of the same networks sort of propagating this same model. And obviously it comes to involve the Republicans as well, but the reason they were able to break into the Democrats arguably first was because of their infiltration of unions, which is historically, or at least specifically at this point in time, was a power base for the Democratic Party. And so what this team up between the nascent intelligence apparatus and organized crime was born out of this exact phenomenon. So basically, the National Crime Syndicate had taken over the dock workers union in New York, and the Office of Naval Intelligence was attempting to thwart would-be German saboteurs in that particular harbor. So in order to get intelligence, i.e. information from dock workers, they had to go through the union. The union's controlled by the mob. Thus, there has to be a covert alliance with the mob. And this event, or alliance, I guess, is remembered today as Operation Underworld, but the US government denied its existence for about 60, 70 years, something like that. So after the war ends, it becomes essentially a symbiosis. So instead of just being out of wartime necessity, it's something that is clearly profitable to both sides of this alliance, and it continues and deepens over time. So for people familiar, to not get into too much detail beyond this point, people are probably familiar, for example, with organized crime overtones in the John F. Kennedy assassination, for example, which, you have Jack Ruby, for example, Jack Rubenstein being sort of part of an affiliate of the Jewish mob down in Texas, who comes up in my book to an extent. And a lot of, wet works or black ops, assassination stuff involved a lot of mob figures, because remember, Mayor Lansky, for example, he created Murder Inc. It was called, essentially mob hitmen. So, the CIA was drawing some of their assassins from these circles. But also a lot of it didn't just have to do with that. A lot of it was financially based, right? So, organized crime had been very successful in sort of dominating offshore finance, specifically in the Caribbean, and significantly so in places like pre-Castro Cuba. But the CIA and the OSS made significant use of a lot of these same offshore tax havens and financial institutions. So there, a lot of this, symbiosis can be seen there as well. So, and I guess one thing that would sort of unite these groups is that organized crime, even before the OSS and entities like that were even created, was very prolific in the use of blackmail, specifically on politicians. And this is something that, of course, the intelligence services get into as well. And even before, this nascent American intelligence apparatus existed, the British were very involved in this. And of course, for anyone familiar with the beginnings of American intelligence agencies. Britain's intelligence services played an outside role in influencing the OSS and subsequently the early years of the CIA. Of course, corporate America also informing that, and a lot of the early bigwigs, I guess you could say, at the CIA were intimately linked to Wall Street and the American oligarch clans, which were battling, sort of having factional battles between them over who was going to be on top and whatnot. And so a lot of these families, people probably know the names like the Rockefellers, the Mellons, all at the Morgans, like JP Morgan, all sorts of, prominent families like this. And they had a lot of, spies for hire essentially working for them. And these are really the three pillars: organized crime, oligarchs and their they're fixers, I guess. And then the intelligence agencies, this is what essentially swirls together and combines to create a lot of what we see today. And blackmail has historically been a major part of that. And so I tried and focused to an extent because of the Epstein angle on sex blackmail. But a very important theme that's been overlooked for some time is that there was also efforts to financially blackmail people by gaining access to their accounts and their financial activity and surveilling it for that for those purposes. So, for example, you have Armand Hammer from Occidental Petroleum attempting to acquire, I think it was called American Bank shares, which eventually is taken over and used as the vehicle for BCCI's entry into the U.S. financial system. But before then, Armand Hammer wanted to acquire that same bank because a lot of congressmen had accounts there, and he explicitly wanted to use that for financial blackmail, leverage. And so, you have the sex angle and you have the financial angle. So even in Epstein's particular case, you have a constant theme of financial crimes as well as sex crimes. And that's really a microcosm of this broader system, which historically has involved both to a significant degree. And you really can't, in the Epstein case, or even in looking at this broader network in which Epstein was enmeshed, you can't really separate the financial crimes from the sex crimes. They're both extremely significant.
It almost seems like you can't make it in politics unless you have blackmailable material in your background. Like, unless, there's a control file around you, you're not going to go anywhere in politics.
Yeah. If you can't be, if they don't,
exposed.
Yeah, if they don't think they control you, they'll force you out. They'll gerrymander your district or they'll destroy you. So one example that I sort of touched on in the book involved a congressman that was having a tiff with J. Edgar Hoover and had sort of known Roy Cohn, who's Trump's mentor and was very close to Hoover and was Joe McCarthy's general counsel. And Roy Cohn was sort of a go-between Hoover to this congressman whose name is escaping me for the moment, but he was basically a critic of surveillance by Hoover and others. And Hoover wanted him to do something, a sort of weaponize a Senate hearing against Robert F. Kennedy, a longtime enemy of Hoover, right? And the congressman, I believe, is Cornelius Neil Gallagher. And so Gallagher didn't play along, and so he was threatened by Hoover, and Hoover planted stories with compliant media about him being involved with organized crime, even though Hoover himself had demonstrable organized crime connections and was allegedly blackmailed by organized crime, blackmail being of a sexual nature in that case, because Hoover at this point is well known to have been a closeted homosexual. So Gallagher was essentially, he stood his ground and didn't, denied the stories and fought back against Hoover, but eventually got thrown out anyway. And there's a very instructive quote there, as told by Gallagher. He was told by Cohn that Hoover said that Gallagher had to go because he couldn't be trusted to play ball with their side. Essentially, I'm paraphrasing. But if they don't think that you're willing to play along and play their games, they'll get rid of you. And they have a lot of ways to do it. I mean, you even have people like Chuck Schumer a few years ago saying things like, oh, if you screw the intelligence community, they have like 6 ways to Sunday to get back at you or something like that, right? And I think that's quite accurate. Mm-hmm.
It seems the same playbook as, that the economic hitman model. except
Oh,
that's
sure.
done foreign.
Mhm.
This is done domestically. It's all the same playbook, really.
Yeah, and it's really organized crime if you think about the tactics, or you could define it as terrorism, perhaps, and based on some metrics, that it's the use of fear and sort of hostage taking threats to get what
Right.
you want.
And one of the things you've mentioned more than once is that it's not necessarily ideological. I mean, they may espouse ideological
Yeah.
touch points, but it's really, this is a business, and business is good.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the illegal happenings of intelligence agencies, particularly in the 1980s, that were found out, a lot of it was justified because, oh, this is the Cold War, and this is all anti-communist activity, and okay, so maybe wasn't great optics to do those things, but we had to do it to stop communism, right? And
Mhm.
then what I note in the book is that those same people responsible for things like Iran-Contra, for example, roughly a decade later in the Clinton administration, are involved in basically selling out U.S. national security by signing off on really insane tech transfers of highly sensitive U.S. military technology to China. Right.
Mhm.
So if had to do all of these awful things and, sign off on the disappearing of thousands upon thousands of dissidents in Latin America to stop communism and back all these military dictatorships and back all these death squads in places like Guatemala and El Salvador to stop communism. And then less than a decade later, you're teaming up with, the ostensibly big communist adversary in the world and improving their access to military technology, which at some point will likely be used against the United States. Is it really anti-communist ideology that's motivating you? Absolutely not. It's money and power that's
Mhm.
motivating them, and I think that's abundantly clear over time. And in the book I try to make a pretty clear case for that. And sometimes it's hard because a lot of this is, it's not necessarily easy to see the patterns in it. But if you take the detail oriented approach, which is what I did in the book, you see that, over the span of time I cover in the book, you see the same patterns repeating themselves over and over. And it becomes very hard to argue that it's all just a coincidence.
Right. Now, what kind of, I'm going to shift topics a little bit because I saw some references once. I can't remember if it was your site, Unlimited Hangout, or American Vagabonds, one, or even maybe Mint Press that you used to write for.
Mm-hmm.
But you're coming under some deplatform pressures, right? Like your hosting company canceled you and stuff like that. And this is my area of interest. I run a domain registrar and a web hosting company. I've been
Mm-hmm.
cancel culture for 20 years. So have you come under the gun at all in your journey here of like trying to stop you or attenuate you getting your message out?
So I was deplatformed by Patreon. In terms of my own stuff, I made a specific effort to avoid any sort of hosting company based in the US.
Hmm.
I had one, or initially when I set up Unlimited Hangout, it was all through a company in Iceland that was really
Yeah.
dedicated to privacy and not deplatforming people and things of that nature. However, like I mentioned earlier, I contribute to the Last American Vagabond, and over
Yeah.
there, they had
I think that
very
was the one that
significant
was I'm
problems.
thinking of. Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, the hosting company, which I think at the time it was set up on GoDaddy, which is, you
Yes.
can't get more
Yeah.
corporate than that.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was deplatforming going on there. There was and then TLAV was deplatformed from PayPal, Venmo, a series of financial institutions, social media, of course, YouTube, which was TLAV's main platform. So, I mean, before I joined, it was pretty much exclusively a video thing, and
Hmm.
over time has become more of a mix between articles and Ryan Christian's show on TLAV. So, the platforming was really extensive, but a lot of it was focused on TLAV, and of course, that was at a time when Ryan and I collaborated like very regularly.
Hmm.
When I had to do the book, and of course, I had a baby at the same time. I obviously didn't have as much time on my hands, so it was a little bit less than, but we're hoping to return to regular collaborations. But anyway, a lot of the deplatforming did occur when we were both working together quite extensively. So, it definitely did affect me, not as much as Ryan probably, but and I don't think we're the only ones that experienced that over the past couple of years. I think it's quite clear that there was a certain, segment of people who were extremely censored, some more than others. And a lot of people like to say that it's necessarily, it has, it's biased against conservatives. And I think that's to an extent, but really I would argue that it's more about people who it's been harsher for people who don't subscribe necessarily to any political ideology and who are anti-establishment and who tend to be pro-decentralization and pro-freedom. And that's not necessarily exclusive to conservatives, right? There's a lot of conservatives that aren't necessarily supportive of some of those policies, right? And at the same time, a lot of the deplatforming was related to COVID-19. So, not everyone in conservative media was questioning the narrative at that time, but TLAV was extensively, and a lot of the other websites that were deplatformed aggressively in that same period tended to also have been quite skeptical of the official narratives, which of course 3 years later, a lot of the things that TLAV were censored for and that I had my Patreon shut down for have now essentially been admitted to be true. So there you have it.
Yeah, that is really something, especially the latest, declarations about the lab leak, or not declarations, but you know what I mean? Like now, I mean, no one's coming out to say, okay, it was definitively a lab leak, but everyone, it's pretty well like, okay, we know that this is the most likely scenario, and this is now part of the mainstream.
Yeah, and it's being used, though, I think, for political ends. So it's sort of being treated as, oh, this was all of the Chinese government's fault.
Yeah.
And things like that. But there's a couple problems with the way the narrative is being driven by these latest admissions. Like you have the FBI director, for example, saying this is the most likely scenario, for example. But if you look at who was, working and funding this research, there was a lot of involvement from both the NIH and the Department of Defense of the US in this particular facility. And of course, you had weird shutdowns of Fort Detrick in the same time frame in Maryland, which is, allegedly the source of the anthrax from the 2001 anthrax attacks. And the US has a very extensive biowarfare program that is within the US and really all over the world, including in China, in countries surrounding Russia. For example, with the Ukraine conflict, a lot of attention was brought to some of these Nunn-Lugar centers. A lot of them are called because of the involvement of Sam Nunn and Dick Lugar in these in the creation of these centers, a lot of which were in the Soviet era were used, to produce for biowarfare research, but also to produce pharmaceuticals, and then were sort of repurposed through the Nunn-Lugar system to either become part of the DoD biowarfare program or extensions of Big Pharma. And you can't really divorce, if you want to say that it came from Wuhan and you're not talking about the US government involvement, to me, it's definitely a political thing, because I think it's pretty clear over the past several years, specifically 2015 to now, there's been an extreme effort, and it should be really obvious to everyone, to get the Democrats to be rabidly anti-Russia and to get conservatives to be rabidly anti-China. And ultimately, the two countries that the national security state wants to lead the American people to war with happen to be both of those countries who are allied, right? So who wins at the end of the day from these narratives? And what I found in doing stuff with the book, and more recently with a lot of the research I've done on sort of transnational networks and policy making, groups like the World Economic Forum, these guys collaborate extensively, right? So it's not, sort of this superficial nation state narrative falls apart when you start to really interrogate where power lies. So, for example, a lot has been said, right, since 2016 about the threat of, those awful Russian hackers, they're going to destroy society, and they spread disinformation, all of that. So, of course, a lot of that has since been debunked, probably most recently, some of it by the release of the Twitter files. And and things of that nature. But the World Economic Forum a few years ago teamed up explicitly with the Russian government and a subsidiary, cybersecurity subsidiary of Russia's largest bank, which is tied up extensively with the Russian state, for something called Cyber Polygon, where they were doing a bunch of tests on cybersecurity preparedness that involved some of the biggest banks in the world, including American banks, involved the U.S. government, and not a peep from the Biden administration, or I forget who was in office, but not a peep from the people complaining about Russian hackers, about the WEF teaming up with the Russian state for a massive cybersecurity exercise, for example. And that's because, the World Economic Forum is closer to where power ultimately lies than, a U.S. president at this point, at least since 1963. And it's, it's quite clear that, the WEF itself is not the top of the pyramid, right? But it's definitely closer to the centers of power than the government's, national government leadership that we have today, which essentially exist mainly to enforce policy that's written by other people. With those policies either coming from the World Economic Forum or the Council on Foreign Relations or Chatham House and a lot of these other organizations. And of course, they have their own people that influence them, which more often than not seem to be a college of corporations and central banks at the end of the day. So
this is where your work starts to induce a lot of cognitive dissonance in me. And so, because when I was on Marty Bent's show and we were talking mainly about like technology censorship and decentralized approaches to being uncancelable. So I went on to talk about the tech stack mainly, but we ended up talking a little bit about, I used to say, I don't believe there's this pervasive top-down conspiracy or cabal that controls everything. I just found it a little on the cartoonish side. And it's like, and then I realized that I was actually consciously choosing to believe that because I just don't want to believe that there's some overwhelming centralized force that controls everything.
Well, sure. But I think what you're talking about there is that there are people who have grossly simplified the nature of the issue to be sort of like cartoonish Klaus Schwab, Bond villain, is going to rule the world. And Schwab is by no means at the top, right? He's just one of these useful faces. Same with people like Bill Gates that are publicly rolled out in front of us as promoters of these policies. And then they trickle down from these people or, the organizations they run, like the WEF or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, down to governments who then implement those policies. But, I certainly don't think that they're the people who are necessarily at the top, right?
But
and some people treat them.
Do you think there is a top, or do you think that there are competing factions with outsized influence? And so I always say it's not a conspiracy, it's a dynamic. I mean, there are conspiracies.
Yeah, I think that's
that there's
fair to say. Yeah, I think it's competing factions who have share a lot of the same overarching goals, but they disagree over who gets what part of the spoils and who gets to control what and exactly how we get from point A to point B, right? So a lot of them want more control for themselves, right? So, I mean, if you look at countries around the world, even if they're supposed to be on different sides of this, emerging World War III divide, there's a lot of commonalities, aren't there, in terms of like the implementation of domestic control systems. All of these countries are interested in domestically controlling their population, and they essentially all agree on the technologies that are needed to do that. And essentially agree that restricting freedom domestically is in their interest, right? And so there's a lot of other stuff they agree about as well. So, for example, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, Russia and China support that wholeheartedly. So does the US and Europe, right? So, you start to sort of interrogate some of this, and a lot of the narratives that are put out there sort of dissolve to an extent, because ultimately power is transnational. It's not in this sort of nation state narrative that, we've been told for the past several hundred years. It's a lot more nuanced than that, right? Because, capital is transnational. A lot of these people with a lot of influence in the US have influence in supposed adversary countries, and nothing's done about it. A great example is Steven Schwartzman from Blackstone Capital, who is extensively lobbies the Pentagon, had very close ties, close ties to both the Biden and Trump administrations, and very cozy, of course, with the ruling elite of the Chinese Communist Party. There's no one in Congress, the China hawks or whatever, are talking about Steven Schwartzman and you shouldn't be doing that in this. And, I mean, there's people that are sort of seem to be immune to this stuff, right? And the same thing too with what I mentioned earlier about the 90s and the transfer of sensitive military technology to China. This was investigations into this were shuttered by the Clinton administration, by the George W. Bush administration. It was basically memory hold after 9/11. And it was really some insane corruption. And some of the people, nothing was done to a lot of the top business executives of military contractors who pushed a lot of this through. And one of them, Bernard Schwartz, was Biden's top donor during the 2020 primary campaign. Right. So there's just like a lot of really insane corruption that can't be explained by the existing nation state narrative. And what's unfortunate, though, is a lot of people, even in independent media, still really subscribe to that and can't really move out of that paradigm or envision a paradigm where that isn't so, and there isn't good guys versus bad guys, or this black and white sort of binary mix up. Because the more you look for commonalities, the more you'll find, and ultimately what it shows to me is that states in general are their ruling elite care regardless of what system the government is supposedly showing, democracy, authoritarian, dictator, whatever. They just care about more money and power for them. So you might have a larger ruling elite in the US, right, than maybe some other countries, but essentially the goal is the same and the public suffers the same, right? And it's very silly to assume that some of these people in places like China and Russia will offer a more utopian vision for the world than the masters of the US will, right? So that's why I ultimately take people back to this is about getting local and decentralizing and telling these big guys on top to just F off.
Well, we can go there. I was going to ask you, have you ever, you sound like you've read Murray Rothbard in your background, like Anatomy of the State and other, the road, or Hayek's Road to Serfdom. This is pretty well all in there, or The Sovereign Individual, which I think is the holy writ of the Bitcoin community.
Yeah.
So this whole parallel system, because personally, so everything we've talked about, like how I, try to wrestle with, is it a conspiracy? Is somebody in charge? Whatever. At the end of the day, I look at the economics of the current monetary system, and I believe that they're unsustainable, and that this is why every country is pushing towards a central bank digital currency.
Yeah.
CBDCs will have certain characteristics. They will be anti-freedom, anti-human. I think they're going to be carbon trackers. Like we're going from we had money backed by gold, we're going to money backed by debt, and now we're going to go to money backed by carbon quotas. And the opposite side of that, I call it the great bifurcation, will be decentralized digital energy like Bitcoin, right? Where a person holds their own private keys, they have sovereignty over their money. Whereas on a CBDC, your entire life is going to be in this. They'll gamify it. They'll like, oh, I got my carbon footprint down 20% this year. And you get little exploding confetti on your phone. And you're allowed to have one extra hamburger that month. But everybody, and I think there's going to be this huge divide between people who manage to preserve wealth on this other parallel system. And these parallel systems, I believe, will succeed because I think this incumbent system, which at the end of the day is built on debt, is going to collapse in on itself.
Yeah, but I think what they're trying to do is I think they recognize that inevitability as well, and they're trying to manage the collapse of that system so that they can get as many people on board with the system they have waiting in the wings as possible, which of course is the CBDC. And a lot of people, of course, are not going to be prepared for the ramifications of an economic collapse. And And I think a lot of people, like I've said in some past interviews, are essentially slaves to convenience.
Mm-hmm.
Having to do a lot of things for themselves, or produce their own things, or build communities. It's work that some people just don't want to do, right? And it's a very effective, carrot, I guess, or bait to offer people a semblance of normalcy, as long as they use the CBDC, right? And I think that'll work on a lot of people, but hopefully not enough, right? I mean, ultimately, the success of these agendas comes down to whether or not there will be mass compliance.
When COVID hit and the lockdown started, I remember saying to my wife, people will accept anything to get normalcy back, because there was
Yeah,
such panic and fear. Because at the time, we didn't know if COVID was going to have you didn't know if half your family was going to die of COVID. And you were like,
yeah,
I just want this to end, and whatever they want to do to end it, we will do. And then by
yeah,
the end of it, it seems like institutional credibility kind of bankrupted itself. Like it was managed so badly. They were wrong about everything. The vaccine rollout's a shit show. So now actually I became a little more optimistic after COVID, because I said it pulled 20 years of creeping totalitarianism into 18 months. And that shocked a lot of people awake. They're like, oh, wait,
yeah, sure.
this is where we're headed. I don't want to live in that kind of a world.
Yeah, I hope it was like that too, that they overplayed their hand and more
Yeah.
people are aware of the extent of it. But also, there were a lot of disappointments. Like, a lot of people fell in line, particularly in anti-establishment circles of independent media, particularly on
Yeah.
the left.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean that was really egregious and unfortunate. And it continues to be unfortunate. I mean, a lot of these people have declined to go back and revise a lot of the things they were saying over the past few years. Um,
Yeah.
it's really unfortunate, particularly for people who posture as anti-empire, for example, but are willing to overlook the outsized role of the Department of Defense in either the Wuhan situation, biowarfare in general, or the funding of mRNA vaccines from their inception, and their role in Operation Warp Speed, which developed the mRNA vaccines that have been widely used around the world, and of course, obviously controversial and problematic, as the data shows, right? So,
Yeah.
I think some people, let's hope that it's more people than can necessarily be seen online, because I think it's important to point out that a lot of what we see online, particularly on social media, is heavily manipulated. Almost every social media company was originally incubated by tentacles of the national security state. A lot of them are fused with the national security state, if not from their origin. They are by now, because almost all the big tech companies double as military or intelligence contractors, usually both. So you can't really say where one begins and the other ends. And I shared on Twitter a few weeks ago how the U.S. military was funding research about how to use social media to control human minds like they would control a drone, right? So
Mm-hmm.
these information environments and these algorithms are all there to be weaponized against you, and they're obviously weaponized for the benefit of these people, most specifically the national security state. So you can't really trust anything you see on there, right? Including the number of likes and retweets something gets. It's all manipulated, and it's all for show. I'm only on social media now just because of, this is the work I do, and I have to do everything I can to try and get people to read it in today's environment, right? But, for regular people, I would say RSS feeds all the way, and manage the news feed yourself, and take out the insane social media middleman guy that's obviously, quite corrupt. And, Elon Musk tried to, there was the Twitter files that showed corruption pre-Elon Musk, but even with Elon Musk in charge, it's really not so different, right? Maybe
Yeah.
some accounts have been unbanned, but a lot of the problems continue. And of course, he's a military and intelligence contractor through SpaceX and some of his other firms. So,
He's in his own way. He's like a Trump who is like presents as a maverick against the system, but is very much of
yeah.
the system.
Well, we're told he's the richest man in the world. So under a lot of people's metrics, that means he would be the most powerful man in the world, right? But it's not really so. So if you look at his case, the only reason he was able to accrue that fortune is because he had a lot of businesses that were heavily subsidized by the state. And you don't get those kind of insane subsidies without being on board with something. Or playing ball with particular people and serving a particular faction of the global elite, right? So people like that, these billionaires that are put in front of us, including Bill Gates, these people are allowed to reach that level for a reason. Who allows them to reach that? It's debatable who might be on top, but as far as we can observe as regular people, I mean, it seems to be the BIS, right? Because who controls the money? Would ostensibly control this system. And as far as we know, right, it's the Bank of International Settlements, the central bank of central banks. Maybe there's something above that. I mean, it's not like there's a lot of transparency into how the BIS operates, right? So, but we can assume that it's somewhere around there. So, a lot of it that comes down again, like everything else, to money, right? So, a lot of the stuff I talk about in the book, right? Financial crimes. And a lot of the stuff that we have to think about going forward as a society is money. And a lot of what they're trying to do to force us into what is essentially a slavery system is money related. And it's about really that slavery system is being masqueraded and disguised as a financial system, right?
What cracks me up about, especially I call it WEF speak, is that they always have this like perfunctory moral framing around
of course,
and the way that like we're gonna recontextualize, we're gonna reimagine, and they use all these nice buzzwords, but they're really presenting something like demonic, right? Like,
well, totally. A great example, Larry Fink, the past two COPs, right? COP 26 and COP 27. He's on camera saying, if we want to get serious about saving the environment and climate change, we have to reimagine the World Bank and the IMF.
Yeah.
And then you look into what he means by that, and you see, oh, Larry Fink is a principal at GFANZ, the Global Alliance for Net Zero. Yeah. And GFANZ policy documents say that reimagining the World Bank and the IMF means, instead of using them, as they've historically been used since they were created as essentially extensions of U.S. imperial power, let's instead recreate them so that they explicitly serve the banks that compose GFANZ. Right. So instead of being, in U.S. military documents, and I've reported on this on the past, the IMF and the World Bank were both referred to as weapons of U.S. imperial, unconventional weapons of the U.S. military. So now, if we reimagine the World Bank and the IMF as Larry Fink has been proposing, that would make them weapons of Wall Street directly.
Yeah.
Does that save the climate, or does that help the bankers who all happen to be in charge of the UN climate change policy? Which, by the way, the UN put in charge of climate change policy, Mark Carney and Mike Bloomberg.
Yeah.
So tell me how that helps the regular
Canadian boy there. People. He's going to be prime minister someday. I'm dreading it. It's going to be a rough ride.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. I mean, we're coming up to the hour, so I don't want to keep you too long. Let's maybe talk a little bit more about, I like to leave people on an optimistic note, parallel systems, taking control of your own mind. You've talked a lot about that. You want to leave us with any parting thoughts on that?
Sure. So a lot of people, including me, when I talk about this stuff, try and give more practical solutions. But I think not enough is said, including from me, about how much of this is really a mental game. So you mentioned earlier what I brought up on Robert Breedlove's podcast about like the colonization of our minds. And I think, part of this situation that we're seeing unfold, a lot of it, even people in the military have done presentations on the past. The battlefield of the future is the human brain, the human mind, right? And so a lot of social media and media in general is aimed at influencing how people perceive something. And when you control human perception, you essentially control human behavior, don't you? And so a lot of this is aimed explicitly at that. And I think people underestimate the extent to which that is the focus to a very significant degree. So the best thing you can do is to make your mind as independent as it possibly can, and sort of go and analyze a lot of the stuff that you've been taught and that you've been led to believe, and sort of it needs to be reassessed all the time, because information warfare is a very serious component of current warfare today. And again, social media is a significant part of that, and I think people would be naive to think that a lot of people in independent media aren't part of that too. Right. So there's a constant need to have to go to the source of the information and reach your own conclusions and decide, use your critical thinking skills, because there's been decades and decades and decades worth of effort from the powers that be to essentially erode people's ability to think critically. And another thing too is, just as much as physical preparedness for what's to come, mental preparedness is also important. So in a time of panic, I mean, we saw this with COVID, right? If people that were able to keep their cool were able to plan more effectively, people that are panicked and just focused on the fear tend to make poor, impulsive decisions, right? That's not going to help you in a time of crisis. I live in South America. I know people from Argentina, for example. There was a total economic collapse there in 2001. From what I've gleaned from that, the people who were most mentally prepared for it were the most successful.
Right. It's all a mental game, really.
A lot of this is a mental game, and I think, again, a lot of people unfortunately underestimate that. And you do not need any money or capital to sort that out. That's something you can do for free within yourself, right?
And that actually, you sort out your mental game, you will become more financially independent and less reliant, just as an outcome of that.
Right. And also this idea of how accustomed we've been to convenience, and how recognizing that convenience is what's being used to hurt us into the system, I think is also important. It may be inconvenient to try and grow a portion of your own food, but a lot of the food system is being weaponized, poisoned. I mean, it's not just about food independence. It's seriously like a major health thing at this point, right? And and it's only picking up. So a lot of people, I think, need to understand too, be able to see the convenience. Once you can see that that's the main carrot that people are using, these people are using to drag us along, you can start to recognize it more. And it takes time for some people, but a lot of people are like, I live in the wrong place to prepare. I don't have time or money. Well, I mean, you can sort out your own brain, can't you? So there's stuff everyone can do, and you don't even have to necessarily be able to have the money to go off grid and all of that. I mean, while the internet is still the way it is, there's plenty of time to make libraries of useful traditional skills and develop your own abilities. You can just learn how to do I taught myself how to knit watching YouTube, for example, right? I mean, there's a lot of different things you can do, and you can improve yourself without spending any money, right? Because those skills become valuable. A lot of people in the US have forgotten about all this stuff because it's all been outsourced, and we've been consistently outsourcing our basic needs to corporations and people that want to turn us into their slaves. So, if you don't want to do that, you have to sort of take some responsibility back, and we've sort of been conditioned culturally to not do that, right?
The other thing you can do that costs you no money and will actually make you money is to identify if you have any addictions and get rid of them. Like over the holidays, right?
Sure.
I realized, so I got really sick over the holidays, first time in like 30 years, and so sick I couldn't drink coffee. Okay. And so I have this mind-splitting headache going on for like 4 days of like, I can't even function because I can't drink coffee because and I'm going through caffeine withdrawal. And I said to my daughter, I said, here I am, Mr. Prepper, Mr. Be Prepared, Mr. What are we going to do if civilization collapses? And I won't be able to function if civilization collapses unless I can get my hands on some coffee. Right. So so I got to wean off of coffee or stop smoking cigarettes or whatever it is. And then suddenly that's getting you down that path of momentum of taking control of over your own life. So.
Yeah. And another point I want to leave people with is stuff that I've been thinking about in terms of like the bigger picture. So why is all this effort being made into creating this particular control system, and why is there such a vast interest globally in controlling human beings to that extent? I would argue that there's a certain class, mainly in the elite, and you can see antecedents of this in the work for the elite by people like Edward Bernays, an example, who invented public relations and propaganda at the same time, essentially. They see, when they look at regular people, they see chaos and they see unpredictability. And they want to be able to predict everything. So a lot of what's going on isn't just about controlling the present, what in this system they want to implement. It's about pre-crime or predicting. It's all predictive. It's about predicting the future, essentially.
The managerial state. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what they're trying to do is turn all of that chaos into order so that they never have to worry about that chaos coming back. But what is that chaos really? I would argue that a lot of that chaos is really born out of human creativity and imagination and ingenuity and all of that. And a lot of these people in the upper classes don't have that. Right.
Right.
And they don't like it. They don't like they're trying to turn that into order. And ultimately, this is why this is a fight against the natural world as well, because the natural world, life, what makes us humans and humanity and life what it is that it's creative and expansive, and reducing it down to complete order and predictability is what they want, but it's also impossible. When
we
you
live
understand
in an out of control
the nature
world
of things. They want like a sterile, controlled world. And given what we know about physics, at least, it's impossible to do that. So, they can't succeed in the long term. How much damage will they do in the short term? I mean, that ultimately depends on us, right?
Yeah, that's
but
always the big question.
It's important to point out that like their schemes are completely against natural law and thus cannot succeed, at least in the long term, right? And I think a lot of stuff that they're going to try and use to force us into this system and that sort of mentality, including artificial intelligence, I think a lot of it they're going to end up faking along the way. I think they'll probably fake the singularity before they actually have it, and things of that nature. But how so if these people are obsessed with order, how can you like drive them crazy? Be as creative and unpredictable as possible, ultimately, because I mean that's what drives them nuts. And one key point about this, even in the current era, when people talk about this dystopian system we're being led into, they like to cite famous novels like Brave New World in 1984, which are, Orwell and Huxley. Those sort of came out of the same aristocratic groups in England, right? But there was another person that wrote a dystopian novel of a similar flavor well before Orwell or Huxley. His name was Yevgeny Zamyatin. He was a Russian. He died penniless and totally forgotten in exile. And he wrote, his book is called We. And essentially what happens in We, spoiler alert for people that would like to read it, instead of using the tactics that are in Brave New World in 1984, what the one state, it's called, does to ultimately exert indefinite control over their citizens is that they forcibly subject citizens to brain surgery to remove the part of the brain responsible for imagination. Right. And I would argue there is a reason why that book is totally forgotten and the other ones are promoted a lot more. Because ultimately, if you look at what they're trying to stop, it's that, right? Yeah. And so this is ultimately a battle over what makes us human. And, it really is a battle for the fate of the species, to be sure. And I think people really need to recognize that's part of the game. And so the more joy and creativity and spontaneity of life, the more you can be that vivaciousness of life, which is what we want to protect and what we're fighting for anyway. The more you can exude that, the more damage you're doing to their designs. That's how I feel.
That's great. Whitney, this has been worth the years it's led up to this conversation. I'm so glad that you came on.
Thank you.
And, I heard back from Liz, who's proof listening it. That's going to get, so the audio volume 1 is going to be out within the next few weeks, and then we're on to volume 2. And I would love to have you back on sometime, talk more about transhumanism and this
Sure, I'd love to.
dream of AI. So that would be great. So
yeah.
You're reachable at unlimitedhangout.com. Where are you on Twitter?
Yeah, so my handle on Twitter is @_ Whitney Webb. I'm also on Telegram, but not under my name, under Unlimited Hangout, the site. There's another Whitney Webb channel that's not me. It's Unlimited Hangout's the only channel I have. And I think on my Twitter bio, I have like a Linktree link in there. You can see, you know, I'm on other social media platforms as well, the smaller ones. I don't have a YouTube channel. I only post videos on places like Odyssey and stuff like that. I'm not interested in playing ball with big tech very much, so you know, I don't tend to invest.
At all? Have you started playing?
No, I haven't. I don't know enough about it, so I tend to regard a lot of these new platforms with some skepticism, but you know, maybe over time some will prove worthier than others, right?
It's not a platform, it's a decentralized
I've heard it was
protocol.
Decentralized. Yeah.
I think this one's got legs. I think it's
well, I'll look forward to checking it out then. Thanks.
All right, okay, thanks Whitney, have a great day.
Thank you. You too.